The day Birdie Hawthorne buried her husband, the land agent from Colton County rode out to the homestead and told her she had 30 days to vacate the property or prove the claim was hers by law. She did not cry. She had already spent her tears in the churchyard, standing over a mound of red Oklahoma dirt, while the preacher read scripture and the wind bent the prairie grass flat against the earth. She had cried enough to last a lifetime in those first hollow hours after they carried Thomas home on a wagon board. His chest caved in from where the roof beam had fallen. She had cried and then she had stopped, because there were 2 children watching her from the doorway of the sod house, and they needed to see something sturdier than grief standing between them and the wide, indifferent sky. So when the land agent, a barrel-shaped man named Orville Fitch who smelled of pipe tobacco and self-importance, told her that without a properly registered deed in her own name, the claim would revert to open territory, she looked him square in the eye and said, "Then I will register it." Fitch had smiled the way men smiled at women when they thought the women did not understand things. "The county seat is in Redemption, Mrs. Hawthorne. That is 4 days' ride northeast. Hard country between here and there, especially for A." He had paused, searching for a word that would be polite enough to hide his meaning. "Especially for a widow," she had finished for him, and closed the door. That was the 18th of September, 1889, which was the year the unassigned lands of Oklahoma Territory had been opened to settlement, and the country was still raw and unsettled as a fresh wound. Claims were staked and contested and stolen with alarming regularity. The law was trying to keep pace with the land hunger, but law moved slow and land hunger moved fast. Birdie Hawthorne was 31 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in her boots, had dark auburn hair that she wore in a practical braid, and brown eyes that her husband had once compared to good river water, which she had taken as the most honest compliment she had ever received. She was not a woman given to sentiment, but she was given to stubbornness, and when she looked at the 160 acres of Oklahoma Territory that she and Thomas had broken their backs over for 2 years, she felt something so fierce and protective rise in her chest that it almost frightened her. She had her neighbor, a good-hearted woman named Pearl Dubois who lived 3 miles east, come and stay with the children. Her son, Walter, was 9 years old, solemn and brown-haired like his father. Her daughter, Clara, had just turned 6 and still had a habit of reaching for Thomas's hand at supper before remembering he was gone. Pearl arrived with a basket of biscuits and a look that said she thought Birdie was out of her mind, but respected her too much to say so. "You know the route?" Pearl asked, standing in the yard in the early morning dark, watching Birdie cinch the saddle on her roan mare, a sturdy animal named Duchess that had better sense than most men Birdie had known. "Thomas drew me a map last spring," Birdie said. "Before." She did not finish the sentence. Pearl nodded. She understood about the befores and the afters. She had her own. "I'll keep the children fed and honest," she said. Birdie kissed both her children, who were still warm with sleep, tucked her husband's land claim documents into the leather saddlebag alongside a change of clothes, a water skin, dried beef, hardtack, and a small pistol that she knew how to use, and she rode north into the dark. The first day was the easiest. The land she knew. She crossed her own creek, past the stand of cottonwood trees where Thomas had proposed to her 4 years ago back in Missouri, long before Oklahoma was a word in their vocabulary, and she followed the old buffalo trace north until the familiar landmarks gave way to country she had only seen on paper. The sky was enormous here, and the grass ran in every direction like a sea that could not decide where to go. She stopped at midday to water Duchess and eat a small portion of her provisions, then pressed on. By evening of the first day, she had covered nearly 30 miles. She made camp under a limestone overhang where a thin creek ran cold and clear, hobbled Duchess, built a small fire from dried brush, and lay down on her bedroll looking up at a sky so thick with stars, it seemed almost impossible that there was also darkness between them. She thought of Thomas. She thought of his hands, which had been rough from work and warm in a way that had surprised her every time, the way something reliable could still surprise you. She told herself she would think of him as fuel, not as weight. She told herself the land was for Walter and Clara as much as it was for her, and that Thomas would have done this same thing without a moment's hesitation. She slept hard and woke before first light. The second day was harder. The trace vanished into the broader prairie, and she had to navigate by Thomas's map, which he had drawn in pencil on the back of a flour sack, and by the sun, and by the particular angle of the wind. The country here was rough, broken by creek draws and sandstone ridges that forced her to pick her way carefully. Duchess was sensible, but she was also tired, and Birdie felt the horse's reluctance in the way the mare's gait grew heavier as the afternoon wore on. She crossed a dry creek bed where the banks had recently been cut by flooding, and the going was treacherous with loose shale. Duchess slipped once, caught herself, and Birdie stayed loose in the saddle the way Thomas had taught her. "Don't fight the horse," he had always said. "Trust the horse." She trusted the horse. In the afternoon she crested a ridge and saw smoke rising in the distance, which resolved itself as she drew closer into a small settlement of maybe a dozen buildings strung along a creek bank. A sign on the largest building read, "Wicker Ford General Provisions." She stopped there, filled her water skin, bought a small amount of grain for Duchess from a man who seemed startled by her presence, but was decent enough not to ask questions. She was not in the mood to answer, and moved on. That night she camped in a creek hollow, and the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that came in off the northern plains in September like a reminder that summer did not own the country. She wore her extra shirt over her regular one and piled her blanket close. A coyote called somewhere to the west. She did not find the sound lonely. She found it companionable in the way that wild things could be when you were also out in the wild. She thought about the claim. Orville Fitch had explained, with the condescending patience of a man explaining things to someone he had already decided was incapable, that a claim in the Oklahoma Territory under the Homestead Act required the head of household to register in person at the Territorial Land Office. Thomas had filed the original claim on the day of the run in April, but the registered deed had never been transferred to include Birdie's name independently. If she could present the original documentation and file a widow's successor claim, she could hold the land. But Fitch had been clear. It had to be done in person in redemption before the 30-day window closed. Otherwise the claim went back into the pool, and any man with a horse and an appetite could stake it out from under her. The injustice of it sat in her chest like a stone. That Thomas had worked that land, had broken it and seeded it and buried his own sweat and hope into every acre, and that she had worked it beside him, had run it without him for 5 months now since the accident, and that a single absent signature could undo all of it, that was the kind of thing that made her understand, in a way she rarely let herself, how the law had been written by people who had never imagined her standing there at all. She pushed the stone aside. She slept. The third day nearly broke her. She had been riding since dawn when the weather changed. The sky went the color of dirty copper in the south, and she felt the barometric shift in her ears the way she had learned to over 2 years on the prairie. A storm was coming. She urged Duchess to a faster pace, but there was nowhere to shelter on this stretch of open ground, nothing but grass and sky, and the storm, when it broke hard. Rain came in sideways, driven by a wind that had the feel of genuine malice. Lightning split the eastern sky, and Duchess skittered and blew, and Birdie held firm with her knees and spoke to the mare in a low, continuous voice, the kind of talking you do more for yourself than for the horse. She pulled her hat brim down and kept moving north. Thomas's map was soaked through, but she had memorized it by now, had traced its lines with her finger so many times in the firelight that she could see it when she closed her eyes. She was riding blind through the rain when she heard someone shout. She turned Duchess toward the sound and found herself approaching what appeared to be a camp. A large canvas tent pitched under a stand of post oaks, with 2 hobbled horses and a small wagon covered by a tarpaulin. A man stood in the opening of the tent, waving her in. "Getting out of the weather," he called. "Plenty of room." She hesitated. She was not by nature a woman who hesitated, but she was also not a woman who was reckless. She assessed the situation the way Thomas had taught her to assess country. Look at what is, not what you fear. She saw one man, no weapons visible, a decent camp, sensible horses. She rode to the tent. The man's name was Samuel Crow, and he was a surveyor from Kansas who was mapping the new Oklahoma Territory boundaries for the federal government. He was perhaps 50, with a gray beard, kind eyes, and the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades outdoors and had long since made peace with the weather. He helped her unsaddle Duchess and get the mare under a rope strung between two oaks, gave the horse grain and a rub-down with an old piece of burlap, and then brought Birdie inside the tent where a small iron camp stove was doing heroic work against the cold. "Where are you headed?" he asked, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "Redemption," she said. "Land office." He looked at her with a measuring kind of respect. "That's another day and a half from here, assuming the weather breaks. You alone?" "I am." He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, which was the kind of thing men said when they had decided to respect a situation instead of arguing with it. They sat through the storm sharing coffee and a meal of salt pork and beans that he prepared on the camp stove. He told her about the territory, about the survey work, about the way the government was trying to impose clean rectangular order on land that refused to cooperate. She told him about the claim, about Thomas, about the 30-day window, about Orville Fitch's smile. "Fitch," Samuel said, with a note of recognition. "I have met that man. He is exactly the kind of man who would smile like that. Do you know if the land office in Redemption will they even hear a widow's claim? Is there precedent?" "There is precedent," Samuel said. "The Homestead Act has provisions. But it depends entirely on who is sitting behind the desk when you walk in. Some men will read the law straight. Some men will read it with their own interests attached." He paused. "I hear the fellow running the Redemption Land Office is a man named Langston, Grant Langston, came from the federal office in Guthrie. They say he is thorough." "Thorough how?" Birdie asked. "Thorough in the way that means he follows the law without decorating it," Samuel said, "which in this territory is rarer than you would think." The storm blew itself out by midnight. She slept on a folded blanket near the stove, and in the morning Samuel gave her a proper breakfast and clear directions for the final stretch to Redemption. He refused payment. He said, with a simplicity she found utterly honest, that he had daughters of his own. She rode the fourth day with a clarity of purpose that had been building in her since she left home. Her body ached from 3 days in the saddle, her hands were chapped raw, her braid had come half loose under her hat, and she did not care about any of it. The sky had been washed clean by the storm, and the morning air was so bright it almost had a sound to it. The land rolled and broke and opened, and in the early afternoon she topped a long ridge and saw Redemption below her. It was not a large town. The main street was a quarter-mile of packed dirt lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a blacksmith, a church at the far end, and several other enterprises of varying ambition. But at the northern end of the street, set slightly apart, was a building with a painted sign that she could read even from the ridge. United States Land Office, Redemption, Oklahoma Territory. She sat there for a moment. Duchess was blowing soft and steady beneath her, and the wind moved through the mare's mane. Birdie thought of Thomas. She thought, "I am bringing it home." She straightened her back, settled her hat, and rode down. She tied Duchess at the rail outside the land office and pushed open the door. The room inside was modest and functional. 2 wooden desks, several large ledgers stacked along the back wall, a map of Oklahoma Territory pinned above a shelf of record books, a small iron stove in the corner, and the smell of paper and ink and order that she associated with institutions trying to do the right thing in disorganized places. Behind the larger of the 2 desks, a man was bent over a ledger, writing with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he wrote would matter. He looked up. Grant Langston was 34 years old, though he looked both younger and older than that depending on what aspect of his face you settled on. He was lean without being thin, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in deep shade, a kind of dark gray-green that shifted when the light changed. He had a strong jaw, 2 days of stubble, and the look of a man who took his work seriously, but had not yet let the work make him humorless. He wore a white shirt, a dark vest, and no gun at his hip, which was unusual enough in Oklahoma Territory in 1889 to be noteworthy. He looked at Birdie Hawthorne, who was standing in his doorway with trailed dust on her clothes and her hat in her hand and her chin level as a surveyor's line, and he felt something shift in the room that he could not immediately account for. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said. "I need to file a widow's successor claim," she said. "Under the Homestead Act. My husband filed the original claim in April. He passed in April. I have the original documents." She crossed the room and set the saddlebag on his desk and began to remove papers. They were wrapped in oilskin and had survived the 4 days and the storm in remarkably good condition, which was itself a statement about how carefully she had handled them. Grant set down his pen. He watched her lay out the papers with a precision that told him she had been thinking about this for a long time, had organized them the way someone organized things when they knew they would have to be persuasive. "You rode here," he said. "Yes." "From your claim?" "Yes, 4 days south and west. I left the 18th. He did the mathematics, and something crossed his face that she did not immediately have a name for. "You rode 4 days alone through that country to file this claim?" "I did." She met his eyes. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and he said it with a quiet gravity that was entirely different from Orville Fitch's condescending smile. "No, ma'am, that is not a problem at all." He paused, looking at the documents, then at her. "I have been at this desk for 6 months, and I have never seen a woman ride 4 days alone through hard country to file her own claim in person." There was nothing dismissive in his voice. There was something that sounded, she thought, like plain and undisguised admiration. She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she did not know what to do with. She set it aside and focused on the task. "Then I hope you know how to process one," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close. "Sit down, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Let's look at what you have." What she had was thorough. Grant Langston had processed dozens of claims in his 6 months in redemption, had seen documentation ranging from detailed and careful to barely legible pencil marks on barn wood, and he could tell within 60 seconds of examining a set of papers how seriously the filer had taken the process. Birdie Hawthorne's documents told him everything he needed to know about who she was. Thomas Hawthorne had filed an original claim on the 7th of April, 1889, during the land run, with the proper survey coordinates, the proper legal description, and the proper fee receipt. He had registered it through the Guthrie office, which was standard. There was a marriage certificate, also in good condition. There was Thomas Hawthorne's death certificate, dated late April, signed by the county coroner in Colton County. There was a letter from Orville Fitch explaining the situation with the precise combination of bureaucratic helpfulness and personal self-interest that Grant had learned to read like a second language. Grant read everything twice. Birdie sat across from him and waited. She did not fidget. She did not fill the silence with nervous talk. She sat with the particular stillness of someone who had decided the situation was what it was, and that patience was the appropriate response. "The documentation is in order," he said finally. She exhaled, and he noticed the almost invisible way her shoulders came down, just slightly, just enough to tell him how much she had been holding. "However," he said, and watched those shoulders come back up, "there are 2 issues I need to work through." "Tell me," she said. He turned the ledger around so she could see it. "The original claim was filed in your husband's name only, which is standard practice under the current Homestead Act regulations. In the case of widows, Section 7 allows for successor filing, but it requires a formal affidavit stating that you are the surviving head of household, that you have actively maintained the claim since your husband's death, and that you intend to fulfill the remaining residency requirements yourself. I have maintained it, she said. I have lived on it every day. I have a neighbor who will attest to that. Do you have that attestation in writing? She opened her mouth and then closed it. She did not have it in writing. In all her preparation, in all her careful organization, she had not thought to get Pearl Dubois to write a formal letter of attestation. The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then Grant said, "That is not necessarily an insurmountable issue. The regulations allow for a sworn affidavit from the claimant herself, witnessed and notarized. I can serve as witness. There is a notary 2 doors down on the main street." She looked at him. "And the second issue," he almost smiled again. She noticed that his almost smiles were becoming something she found herself watching for. "The second issue is that the Colton County land agent, this Fitch, has also submitted a competing request to the territorial office in Guthrie, recommending that the claim be returned to the open pool on the grounds that no valid successor had come forward within the specified period." The stone was back in her chest. "He submitted it already, 12 days ago, before your 30-day window had even closed." Grant held the paper toward her, which is itself a procedural irregularity. She took the paper and read it. It was, as she had expected, perfectly phrased to sound reasonable and fair while being neither. She set it down on the desk with the careful, controlled motion of someone who did not want to show how angry they were. "Can you override it? I have the authority to reject a premature competing claim and accept the properly documented successor filing," Grant said. He said it plainly, without drama, without any sense that he was doing her a favor, and that more than anything else he had said made her trust him. He was not offering grace. He was reading the law. "I will need to send the full documentation to the Guthrie office for final confirmation, which takes approximately 2 to 3 weeks. But for the purposes of protecting the claim during that period, I can issue a temporary protection order today that will prevent anyone from staking or filing against your land while the review is pending." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, and it caught the dust in the air and made the whole room look like something preserved. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, not with suspicion, with genuine curiosity. "Because the law says I should," he said, "and because Fitch filed that early on purpose, and I do not appreciate when people use procedural tricks to move ahead of the clock." She nodded. She understood. She understood perfectly. They spent the rest of the afternoon working through the paperwork. He was precise without being rigid, and he asked her questions to fill in the gaps in the documentation: how long she had been on the claim, what improvements she had made, what her intention was going forward. She answered everything directly and accurately, and he wrote her answers in a clear, steady hand. He had a way of listening that was different from most men she had encountered, a kind of full attention that did not rush ahead of what she was saying or fill in conclusions before she had reached them herself. At one point he made an error in transcription, caught it himself and said, "Pardon me," and crossed it out neatly and rewrote it. Such a small thing. The willingness to admit a mistake in front of a stranger. She found herself cataloging these small things without deciding to. By 4 in the afternoon, the formal affidavit was drafted, signed, witnessed, and they had walked together to the notary 2 doors down, a small man named Mr. Pickett who smelled of cloves and treated the whole proceeding with the grave solemnity of a church elder, and had it properly notarized and returned. Grant issued the temporary protection order, signed it, stamped it with the land office seal, and handed her a copy. "This is legally binding," he said. "No one can move on your land while this is in effect. I will send the full packet to Guthrie by the morning stage." She took the paper and looked at it. 160 acres. Thomas's work, her work, Walter and Clara's future. On a piece of paper in her hands, protected by law because she had ridden 4 days and this man had read the law straight. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without decoration. He looked at her with that almost smile and then something else behind it, something quieter and more considered. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. "I had not thought that far ahead yet," she said, which was true. The planning had stopped at this moment because this moment had seemed large enough to plan for. "The hotel at the south end of the street is decent," he said. "Tell Mrs. Ellery that Grant Langston sent you. She will give you a fair rate." He paused. "And there is a livery stable next door to the hotel where your horse can be properly fed and rested." She thought of Duchess, who had carried her 4 days without complaint and deserved every bit of comfort available. "That is appreciated," she said. She gathered her papers, returned them to the saddlebag, and turned to go. The door she stopped. She was not sure why she stopped. She turned back and he was still watching her in the way that a person watches something they are not quite ready to stop watching. "You said you had never seen a woman ride 4 days alone to file her own claim," she said. "I have not," he said. "Does that strike you as strange?" He considered this seriously, the way he appeared to consider everything. "It strikes me as a shame," he said, "that it had to be done and that it was remarkable for being done." "It should not be remarkable. It should just be the law working the way the law is supposed to work." She studied him for a moment. "Well," she said, "at least one of you thinks so." She left. She got Duchess settled in the livery. The horse practically sighed with relief at the proper stall and the hay and the bucket of water, and then she went to the hotel. Mrs. Ellery was a broad, pragmatic woman who gave her a room on the second floor with a view of the main street and a basin and pitcher for washing. Birdie stripped off her trail-dusty clothes, washed herself from head to foot, and changed into the one clean dress she had packed. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands, which were red and stiff, and felt the full weight of the 4 days settle over her at last. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the look on Grant Langston's face when she had walked in. Not pity, not amusement, that quality of attention that had felt, from the very first moment, like being taken seriously. She was 31 years old and she was a widow, and she had just spent 4 days on horseback across Oklahoma territory in 1889, and she was not entirely sure what she felt, except that she was very tired and the paper in her saddlebag had the land office seal on it, and her children would have their land. She went downstairs and ate supper in the hotel dining room, beef stew and corn bread that were both better than she had expected, and she was sitting over a cup of coffee afterward, watching the evening settle over the main street through the window, when the door opened and Grant Langston walked in. He saw her immediately. He hesitated for just a moment, the kind of hesitation that was not uncertainty but consideration, and then he walked over. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "I did not mean to interrupt. I was coming for supper myself." "You are not interrupting," she said. It came out more easily than she expected. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. She was not sure what she had expected from him outside of the land office. Some men, she had found, were different in the official context of their work, capable and purposeful there, but ordinary or disappointing outside it. Grant Langston was not different. He was simply himself, which was itself something she had not expected. They talked over supper. He told her he had come to redemption from the federal land office in Guthrie, where he had worked for 2 years before the redemption posting opened. Before that, he had been in Kansas, where he had studied law for a year before deciding that the classroom was less interesting to him than the actual country the law was supposed to govern. He had grown up in Missouri, in a small town on the Missouri River, the second of 5 children in a family where everyone worked and no one complained about it. She told him about Missouri, about Thomas, about the decision to come to Oklahoma for the land run, about the 2 years on the claim, about the accident, about the 5 months since. She told it plainly, without seeking sympathy, in the way that people tell things they have already made a certain kind of peace with. "Your children," he said. "How old?" "Walter is 9. Clara is 6. He looked at the table for a moment in a way that told her he was thinking about what that must be like, without saying something inadequate about it. She appreciated the silence more than she would have appreciated words. "What will you do when you get back?" he asked. "To the claim. Finish the harvest," she said. "Then winterize the house. I have been doing it alone, but Pearl, my neighbor, her husband, has been helping with the heavier work. In the spring, I will put in a larger garden and expand the grain crop. I have been thinking about keeping a small dairy herd. There is good water on the south edge of the property." He listened to all of this with the focused interest of a man who found it genuinely interesting. "You have it figured out," he said. "I have it started," she said. "That is different," he smiled. A real one this time, and it changed his whole face into something warmer and more open. She had been right that his almost smiles were worth watching for, because the full version was something else entirely. "That is an honest distinction," he said. They sat talking until Mrs. Ellery began to bank the lamps in the dining room, which was the universal signal that the evening was over. They stood up together outside the dining room door, and she saw that the main street was quiet. A couple of horses at the saloon rail, the sound of a piano drifting from that direction, the stars very bright overhead. "I want to send word to Guthrie personally," he said, by way of explaining what he was thinking about, and she understood he meant her claim. "Not just the stage packet. I will write a covering letter myself with my recommendation, so there is no ambiguity about the nature of the filing or the premature nature of Fitch's submission." "That is more than you are required to do," she said. "It is the right thing to do," he said, "which is often more than what is required." She looked up at him. The starlight and the lamp from the hotel window caught the angles of his face, and she thought about what Samuel Crow had said. Thorough in the way that means he follows the law without decorating it. She thought that was exactly right, and also that it did not fully account for the particular quality of him, the way he seemed to inhabit what was right the way other people inhabited their own skin. "Good night, Mr. Langston," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "I am glad you made it through." She went upstairs. She lay in the bed that night, which was real and soft and an extraordinary luxury after 3 nights on the ground, and she stared at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did in the dark, and she let herself miss him with the full weight of it for a few minutes, because she had learned that the only way to keep grief from becoming a constant emergency was to give it a proper time and place. She missed his steadiness, his humor, his hands, his particular way of whistling off-key when he was working. And then, quietly and without guilt, she thought about Grant Langston's full smile. She thought about it the way you think about an unexpected piece of good weather, with gratitude and some surprise and no particular conclusions. She slept better than she had in months. In the morning she came downstairs to find a note at the hotel desk from Grant Langston, written in his precise and legible hand, saying that he had already dispatched the packet to Guthrie via the morning stage and his personal letter along with it, and that if she had time before she departed, he would like to show her one additional thing regarding the Fitch submission that she should be aware of. She went to the land office. He was there early, already at his desk, and he stood when she entered, which she found she noticed. He poured her coffee from a small pot on the stove without asking if she wanted it, because he had apparently already decided that she was the kind of person who wanted coffee in the morning, and he was right. "I found something last night," he said, spreading a document on the desk between them. "In the regional records, Fitch has filed premature competing submissions on 2 other claims since July. In both cases, the original claimants were not widows, but they were parties who had not yet appeared in person at the territorial office, and in both cases Fitch's submissions redirected the claims to buyers who had, shall we say, existing business relationships with Fitch." Birdie looked at the documents. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. "He is selling them," she said. "That is what it appears," Grant said. He had the careful tone of a man who did not want to state as fact what was still technically inference, but whose inference was plainly sound. "I have written to the regional commissioner in Guthrie about this separately from your claim. It is not your responsibility to pursue it, But you should know that what happened to you was not an isolated incident, and the information in your case helps establish the pattern. She thought about the other claimants. She thought about whoever had lost their land to Fitch's premature filings, who perhaps had not had the stubbornness to ride 4 days to contest it. Those other 2 claims, she said, can they be recovered? One of them was resold quickly. That will be difficult to unwind. The other is still in a holding status. It may be possible. He paused. I intend to find out. She looked at him. You did not have to do any of this, she said. The extra letter, the Fitch investigation. I did not have to, he agreed. But you did not have to ride 4 days through hard country alone in September either, and I suspect that did not stop you. The silence between them was different from the silences of the day before. It had a warmth to it, a kind of recognition. When do you leave? He asked. I was going to start back this morning, she said. My children, of course. He looked at her steadily. It will take you 4 days back. Yes. The weather could shift again. It could, she said. It usually does. He nodded slowly. He was doing what she recognized as the same calculation she had been doing since last night. The assessment of something real and fragile and new, weighing it against the facts of the situation. She had 31 years of life on one side of the scale, and on the other side she had a man she had known for less than 24 hours who had treated her paperwork like it mattered and her intelligence like it was obvious and had smiled at her once fully, and it had reordered something in the room. I am going to come to Colton County, he said. It came out with the directness of a decision already made, not a question. When the Guthrie confirmation comes through 2 to 3 weeks, I will need to personally deliver the finalized deed to the claim holder. That is standard practice for contested filings. Is it? She said. The corner of his mouth moved. It should be, he said. I am making it so. She held her coffee cup and looked at him and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular kind of warmth that came from being seen by someone who was looking at you clearly, without want or pity or condescension, but with something that might, given the right amount of time and the right amount of shared ordinary life, become love. Then I suppose I will see you in 3 weeks, she said. Yes, he said. You will. She finished her coffee. She shook his hand. His grip was firm and direct, and he held on for exactly 1 second longer than was strictly professional, and she went to collect Duchess from the livery. The ride home was different from the ride out. Her body was still sore and the country was still hard, but she carried the protection order in her saddlebag like a talisman, and she had a different quality of thought to keep her company across the 4 days. She let herself think about the future in a way she had not allowed herself since Thomas died, the way you allow yourself to open a window when you are not sure if the air outside will be cold or warm. It turned out to be warm. She arrived home on the 4th day, mid-afternoon, and Walter was running across the yard before Duchess had even reached the gate. He had Thomas's way of running, all knees and serious purpose, and she dropped from the saddle and caught him and held him tighter than she needed to for a long moment. Clara came behind him at a more dignified pace that was entirely her own and pressed herself against Birdie's side, and Birdie stood in her own yard in the September Oklahoma sun with one hand on each of her children, and felt the land under her feet like a foundation. Pearl Dubois came out of the house wiping her hands on her apron, looked at Birdie's face and smiled. You got it, she said. I got it, Birdie said. Pearl made supper that night to celebrate, a proper meal with a pie from the last of the summer apples, and they ate around the table together while Birdie told the children what she had done. She told them clearly and plainly, the way she did everything, that she had ridden to the town with the land office, that she had shown the men there the papers their father had filed, that the law had said the land was theirs, and that she had made sure the law knew that. Walter listened with his chin propped on his hand the way Thomas used to listen. Were you scared? He asked. She considered this honestly. A little the first night, she said, but less than you might think. Why? Because I had something to come back to, she said, and touched his hair. Clara said, Did you meet anyone nice? Birdie thought about Grant Langston's full smile. "I met a few people," she said. "A surveyor named Samuel who was very kind, and the man at the land office was thorough." Clara wrinkled her nose at the word thorough. "That does not sound very nice." "It was, actually," Birdie said. "In the right person it is the nicest thing there is." The next 3 weeks were full. The harvest needed finishing, and Birdie worked it with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Pearl's husband, a wide and gentle man named Daniel Dubois, came over several days to help with the heavier work, hauling cut grain and mending the sod house roof against the coming winter. Walter worked beside the men with an earnestness that made Birdie's heart do complicated things. She had written a letter to Grant Langston. She had written it 3 nights after returning home, sitting at the table by lamplight while the children slept. She had not entirely planned to write it. She had told herself she was writing to inquire about the status of the Guthrie confirmation, which was partly true. But the letter, once it began, did not stay entirely professional. She told him about the harvest. She told him about Daniel Dubois' help and about Walter learning to swing a scythe. She told him about Clara's habit of naming every grasshopper she caught, which was philosophically confusing since they were destroying the garden but Clara had named them, and so killing them had become more complicated than it should have been. She told him about the oak tree at the south edge of the property, which she had been thinking about in the context of the dairy operation she was planning, because the shade and the proximity to the good water together made a natural site for a small barn. She posted the letter with the next person who was heading toward town, which was a stock driver going north. She was not sure what she expected back. What she got back, 11 days later, was a letter in Grant Langston's precise handwriting that was 4 pages long. He told her the Guthrie confirmation was processing smoothly. He told her he had filed a formal complaint against Fitch with the regional commissioner, and that the commissioner had opened a formal inquiry. He told her about the second contested claim he had mentioned, the one still in a holding status, and that he had managed to flag it in the system in a way that would allow the original claimant, a family named Oakes, to file a counterclaim. He told her about the redemption office, about a dispute he had mediated that week between 2 claimants with overlapping survey coordinates, which had come down to a 7-foot strip of land that both men would have fought over and which he had resolved by pointing out that neither of them had the correct survey benchmark, and the strip technically belonged to neither of them. But if they were both willing to adjust their filed boundaries by 3.5 feet on each side, the problem disappeared. They had both agreed, bewildered, and left. He told her about the Missouri River town where he had grown up. He told her about his mother, who had taught school, and had the opinion that stubbornness was only a virtue when it was pointed in a useful direction, which was an opinion he had carried with him. He told her that he had been thinking about what she said, that she had something to come back to. He said that he found himself thinking about that often, and that he was not entirely sure yet what it meant for him, but that he thought it was one of the more honest and useful observations he had heard in a long time. And at the end of the letter, in slightly different handwriting, slightly more careful, as though he had written it last and considered it most, "I am very much looking forward to delivering that deed in person." She read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it away in the cedar chest where she kept important things. She told Pearl about it because Pearl had a way of knowing when Birdie was holding something without letting it out, and because Pearl was the kind of woman who could be trusted with the tender and uncertain things. Pearl listened to the relevant passages, which Birdie read out loud in a neutral voice that did not entirely succeed at being neutral. When Birdie finished, Pearl said, "Well, that man is not writing you 4 pages about survey coordinates because he is purely concerned about your deed." "He is doing his job," Birdie said. "He is doing his job," Pearl agreed, "and also writing you 4 pages. Both can be true." Birdie put the letter away, but she thought about it. She had expected a bureaucratic interaction at the end of things, a courier with a sealed envelope, or perhaps a brief official visit that would last 20 minutes and feel like a closing of accounts. What she had not expected, and had not let herself fully hope for, was what happened on the 22nd day after she had returned from redemption. She was at the south edge of the property, measuring out the placement of the planned dairy barn with a length of rope, Walter helping hold the far end with all the seriousness of a 9-year-old who has been given an important task, when she heard a horse coming from the north. She shaded her eyes and looked. Grant Langston was riding a bay horse with the easy seat of a man who had spent enough time on horseback to be comfortable, but was not the kind of man who performed it. He was dressed practically dark coat, dark hat, a saddlebag that bulged with what she suspected was paperwork. When he saw her, he raised one hand in greeting, and even from across the field she caught the particular character of his face, the focused attention, the almost smile already forming. She stayed where she was. She was holding a length of rope in the Oklahoma sun with her braid pinned back and her working clothes on and the dry grass of September around her ankles, and she did not feel the need to make herself into something more than that. He rode over and dismounted and led his horse the last few yards on foot. He looked at the rope and the stakes and said, "Is this the dairy barn site?" "It is," she said. "Good water access," he said, looking at the creek 20 yards south. "Good shade." He nodded like a man whose professional instincts applied themselves automatically to whatever he was looking at. "That is a well-chosen site." "I thought so," she said. They stood there for a moment, the Oklahoma wind moving between them, and then she said, "You have the deed." "I do." He opened the saddlebag. The finalized deed was in a proper envelope with the territorial seal. He held it out. She took it, opened it, read it through. It was everything it needed to be. 160 acres, registered in the name of Birdie Alice Hawthorne, head of household, successor claimant, with all the proper legal language and signatures. She had a second of seeing Thomas's name in the filing history, the original registration date of April 7th, 1889, and then she folded the deed back into the envelope and held it to her chest for exactly 1 moment, which was all she allowed herself. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." "Fitch has been formally suspended from his position," Grant said. "The inquiry found the 2 previous instances of fraudulent submission. The Oaks family recovered their claim. The other, the resold one, the commissioner is pursuing a fraud action." "Good," she said, firmly. "I thought you would want to know." She did want to know. She thought of those other families and felt something that was partly satisfaction and partly the deep anger that went with understanding how many times people in ordinary circumstances were simply steamrolled by people with the authority and the inclination to do it. "I am glad you pushed it," she said. "I would have pushed it regardless," he said. "But knowing about your case made the pattern easier to demonstrate." They walked back up toward the house. Walter ran over and Grant introduced himself and shook the boy's hand like a person shaking a person's hand, not like a man crouching to condescend to a child, and Walter responded to this with the fierce dignity of someone being treated with appropriate respect. Clara, who had less of Thomas's reserve and more of her own particular weather system, appeared from behind the house, looked Grant up and down, and said, "Are you the man who helped Mama get our land?" "I did some paperwork," Grant said. Clara considered this. "Mama did the writing," she said. "She absolutely did," he said. "The writing was the hard part." Clara seemed to find this answer satisfactory. She vanished back around the corner of the house. Walter followed her at a more measured pace that was supposed to seem like he was not following. Birdie made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table while the afternoon light came through the window at the angle that she loved best, the particular light of the Oklahoma autumn that turned everything to gold and made the sod house feel not like a poverty, but like something fitted precisely to the land it stood on. They talked for a long time. He told her about the Guthrie office's response to the Fitch situation, about the changes being discussed for the claims registration process, about the possibility that a new courthouse would be built in Redemption before the year was out, which would consolidate some of the legal processes and make them more accessible. She told him about the harvest numbers, about her plans for the spring planting, about Walter's interest in learning to read proper surveying maps, which had apparently been sparked by something Walter had heard from somewhere, though Birdie suspected it was from the letter she had read parts of aloud. She told him about Thomas. Not the grief of it, but the person of it, who Thomas had been, what had made him worth grieving. She told it with the steady love of someone who had done their mourning honestly, and carried the loss the way you carry something that is part of you now rather than something you are trying to set down. Grant listened to all of it without flinching, without trying to redirect or comfort, just listened with that full attention. That was one of the things she had cataloged about him from the very first hour. "He sounds like a man who built things well," Grant said when she was done. She looked at him. "He did," she said. "That is a good way to put it." The afternoon slid into evening, and she asked him to stay for supper without exactly deciding to ask, the way you say a thing before you have finished deciding to say it. He said yes without any particular deliberation either, and they moved around the small kitchen together with a natural ease that surprised her because it was the first time she had shared the kitchen with anyone besides Pearl and the children since Thomas, and she had half expected it to feel wrong. It did not feel wrong. It felt, in fact, remarkably ordinary in the way that things feel ordinary when they are correct. Walter sat very close to Grant at supper and asked questions about the land office and survey coordinates, and what the red marks on a territorial map meant. And Grant answered every single question as though it was the question of someone whose curiosity deserved respect, because he apparently believed that it was. Clara ate her food with focused efficiency, and then excused herself to go check on a grasshopper she had found that afternoon, which was, she explained, named Henderson. After the children were in bed, Birdie and Grant sat on the small covered porch in front of the house in the autumn dark. Stars were out, the same enormous Oklahoma stars she had looked up at the first night of her ride to Redemption, the same stars she had been looking at for 2 years of the most difficult and formative period of her life. A coyote called somewhere to the south. The creek said its quiet thing in the dark. The wind moved through the autumn dry grass. "I want to tell you something," Grant said. She waited. "I am not a man who talks about himself very readily," he said. "I am aware that is not always a virtue. But I want to say clearly that the last 3 weeks have been. I have thought about you very often." He looked at the dark carefully, like a man who was being precise because the thing he was saying mattered too much to say carelessly. "The way you walked into my office, the way you laid out those papers, the way you answered my questions, the fact that you rode 4 days alone to do what needed to be done, and the way it was not bravery in the showy sense of the word. It was something quieter and more fundamental than that." Birdie was very still beside him. "I know you are not long widowed," he said. "I know that asks something of you that may not be ready to be asked. I am not asking you to be anything you are not ready to be. I just wanted to tell you plainly that I find you remarkable, and that I would like to come back if you would have me, and that I would like to know you better." She turned to look at him. In the starlight she could see the earnest directness of his face, the complete absence of anything performed about what he was saying. He was simply telling her what was true for him, in the same way he read the law straight, without decoration. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the grief, which was real and permanent and would not be going anywhere. She thought about the letter in the cedar chest, 4 pages long, ending with a sentence about delivering a deed in person. She thought about Clara's grasshoppers and Walter's surveying questions. She thought about the land around her, dark and breathing and alive, that she had ridden 4 days to keep. "I do not know what I am ready for," she said honestly. "I do not know what shape the future is going to be yet. But I know that I have thought about you often as well, and that I was glad when your letter came, and that today has been," she paused. "Today has been good. In a way I had not expected anything to be good for a while." He nodded. He did not push past that or try to make it into more than it was. "Come back," she said. "Come back in a few weeks if you can. For supper, or just to see how the dairy barn site is coming along. Come back and let's just see." "That is all I am asking," he said. They sat in the comfortable dark for another half hour, talking about nothing important and everything real about Missouri, about the coming winter, about what Oklahoma Territory might look like in 5 years, about whether Henderson the grasshopper would survive the cold. And then he said goodnight and rode back toward town in the dark, because it was only 6 miles to the nearest settlement where he could find lodging, and he was a man who respected appropriate limits. He came back in 2 weeks, and then again 2 weeks after that. He brought a proper land survey map for Walter on the second visit, rolled in a leather tube, which Walter received with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. On the third visit, he helped Daniel Dubois and Birdie raise the frame of the dairy barn, which was small but solid, and they worked together through a cold November day with Birdie on the ropes and Grant on the timber, and Daniel directing the whole operation with the calm authority of a man who had built a great many things. By December, he was coming every other week, a 6-day round trip from Redemption, and no one pretended anymore that it was purely a professional matter, least of all Grant or Birdie. The letters continued between visits proper, long letters about real things, about their ideas and observations and the particular texture of their days, and the children had each, in their own way, incorporated him into the regular understanding of their world. Walter showed him every piece of his map collection and explained the survey lines with a gravity that was pure Thomas. Clara announced one day in January without preamble that she had decided Grant was allowed to call her Clara instead of Miss Hawthorne, which was, as Pearl Dubois observed, Clara's highest available endorsement. The dairy barn was finished before the hard winter set in, and Birdie bought 2 dairy cows at a livestock auction in Wicker Ford, negotiating the price herself with a directness that left the seller slightly startled and appreciative. She named the cows with the same practical economy she applied to everything. The black one was 1 and the brown one was 2, which Clara found unsatisfying and Walter found entirely sensible. The winter was long and cold and full. There were hard days when the snow came down hard enough that the visibility from the house to the barn was effectively nothing, and she had to do the chores tied to a rope from the house door. There were evenings when the loneliness of Thomas's absence sat heavy on her in ways that she let it sit, without fighting it, because she had learned that the only way through grief was through. There were mornings when Walter woke from dreams he would not describe, and she held him in the pre-dawn dark without asking him to explain. And there were Grant Langston's letters, arriving through the winter with the reliability of something you could count on, which was perhaps the most important quality they had. He did not miss a letter. He did not write short, distracted notes. He wrote carefully and honestly about everything that mattered to him, including her, and about everything that was happening in the land office and the territory, including the ongoing Fitch investigation and the new claims processes being discussed in Guthrie, and about the things he was thinking about regarding the future that he did not say directly, but that were present between every line. In February, he came for a 5-day visit instead of the usual 2-day turnaround, because the roads were bad enough that the return journey needed to be broken up, and he stayed in the settlement 6 miles east and came over each day and went back at night, which was the properly decent arrangement. On the third evening of that visit, when the children were in bed and the fire was low and the winter dark was very close outside, he reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his. She looked at their hands for a moment. Her hand was still red and rough from the winter work. His was large and warm and still. She thought about the first time she had noticed his hands at the desk in the land office, bent over the ledger, writing her story into the official record. She turned her hand over and held his. They were quiet together for a long time. "Birdie," he said. "I know," she said. "Do you?" "I think so," she said. "I think we are both thinking the same thing." "What am I thinking?" he said, and there was the almost smile very close to the real thing. "You are thinking that you have made this trip 9 times now," she said, "and that the return trip is getting harder each time and that you are not sure how many more times you can do it and ride away." His eyes held hers. The firelight moved between them. "That is very nearly exactly what I am thinking," he said. She held his hand and thought about Thomas, who had loved her well and completely, and whose love she would carry all her life. She thought about the land outside in the February dark, 160 acres that she had fought for and kept, that had Thomas's work in every acre and her own work layered over it. She thought about Walter and Clara asleep in the next room. She thought about what it meant to build something with someone, the kind of building that was not framing and timber and rope, but the other kind, the longer and more complicated kind. "I am not the person I was 4 years ago," she said. "I have had children and worked hard land and buried my husband. I am not easy or soft or uncomplicated." "I know," he said. He said it simply, with complete sincerity. "And I am not done grieving," she said. "I will carry Thomas. That is not going away." "I know that too," he said. "And I am not asking you to put it down. I am asking you to let me walk beside whatever you are carrying." She looked at this man who had read the law straight on her behalf, who had written a personal letter to Guthrie, who had brought Walter a survey map and called Clara Clara when she said he could, who had spent a cold November day raising a dairy barn because she was building a future and he wanted to be part of the building. She thought about the first moment she had walked into his office, the trail dust and the organized papers and the chin level as a surveyor's line, and the way he had looked at her then and the way he was looking at her now, and she understood that those two looks were not very different, that he had been looking at her the same way from the very beginning. "Ask me," she said. "Will you marry me, Birdie Hawthorne?" he said, quietly and directly, the way he did everything. "Yes," she said. "Grant Langston, I will." The spring of 1890 in Oklahoma Territory was the kind of spring that the land put forward like an argument in its own favor. Enormous skies, the grass coming back green and extravagant after the winter, the creek running full, the cottonwood trees along the south edge of the property releasing their seeds in great slow clouds that Clara chased across the yard. Birdie's garden went in early and promising, and 1 and 2 the dairy cows settled into the new barn with a contentment that suggested they had always known where they were going to end up. Grant Langston made arrangements with the federal land office in Guthrie to transfer his posting. The regional commissioner, who had been impressed enough with his handling of the Fitch situation and several other territorial disputes to want to keep him in the region, authorized a new arrangement. Grant would serve as a traveling land commissioner for southwestern Oklahoma Territory, which meant he would cover a wider area from a home base rather than sitting at a fixed desk in Redemption. It was a better position in almost every way, and it meant he could base himself where he needed to be, which was increasingly apparent to everyone, including the regional commissioner. They were married in May in the yard of the homestead because Birdie said the land had earned the right to witness it. Pearl Dubois organized the celebration with an efficiency that suggested she had been planning it for considerably longer than she would admit. Samuel Crow, the surveyor who had sheltered Birdie from the storm on her ride to Redemption, received a letter of invitation that he answered by appearing in person on the morning of the ceremony with a bottle of good whiskey and a handshake for Grant that told Grant everything he needed to know about how much Samuel thought of the woman Grant was marrying. The preacher came from 6 miles east. He was a spare man named Reverend Alcott, who conducted the ceremony with the appropriate brevity and solemnity of a man who understood that the words meant something and were not meant to be stretched beyond their meaning. Birdie wore her good blue dress. Grant wore his dark coat and had, at last, gotten his hair properly cut. Walter stood very straight and serious beside his mother. Clara stood beside him and periodically and inexplicably waved at no one visible, which was Clara's way of managing her feelings about significant occasions. When the preacher said the words and Grant said them back and Birdie said them back, she felt Thomas in the air around her, not as a presence that opposed what was happening, but as a presence that recognized it, the way the land itself recognized a new season without ceasing to be the land. She felt the continuity of things, The way lives built on this ground continued to build forward. The way the grain she had planted in Thomas's furrows had grown into a different harvest. Grant held her hands when he said his words, and she saw the firmness and the feeling in his eyes, and she thought, "This is what it is to be known by someone who sees you clearly and chooses to anyway." "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Alcott said. Grant kissed her. Pearl Dubois made a sound that was half approval and half the particular emotion of a woman who has watched her friend find something good. Walter looked at the sky. Clara cheered. Grant moved onto the homestead. He brought his books, which were numerous enough that they required their own crate, and his surveying equipment, and a rocking chair that had belonged to his mother, and that he placed by the window in the main room with the air of someone settling in for the long term. He and Birdie negotiated the reconfiguration of the small sod house's interior with the practicality of two people who both had strong opinions and also good humor, which turned out to be a better combination than either would have predicted. He was home 2 weeks out of every month, the other 2 spent covering his district. On the weeks he was home, he helped with the land, not in the way of someone inserting himself into work that was not his, but in the way of someone who understood that the work was shared now, that this 160 acres was theirs in the deepest sense. He and Walter developed a habit of Saturday morning surveying walks where they would take the proper instruments and map sections of the property with methodical care, and Walter's notebooks began to fill with the precise markings of someone who was learning to see land the way a certain kind of person learns to see it, not just as earth, but as measured and knowable country. Clara taught Grant to name the grasshoppers properly, which was a skill he applied with a straight face and the complete seriousness that she required. In the summer of 1890, the dairy operation began producing enough that Birdie was supplying 3 households in the nearest settlement with milk and butter, which brought in consistent income alongside the grain crop. She kept the accounts herself in a ledger that she maintained with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and by fall the numbers told a story of genuine stability, the kind that had not seemed possible in the dark months after Thomas's accident. The Fitch investigation concluded that autumn. Orville Fitch was formally removed from his position, fined, and barred from any future federal or territorial land agency work. The family whose claim had been fraudulently resold, the original buyers of the stolen land having themselves been deceived, received a partial restitution from the territorial government, which was not everything they had lost but was something. The Oakes family, whose claim Grant had flagged, filed successfully and were on their land by spring. Birdie heard about the final conclusion through Grant, who had been keeping track of every step of the process. She sat with the news for a moment. She thought about riding into redemption on a 4-day exhausted horse with organized papers in oilskin and a level chin, and she thought about how that single act of refusing to accept Fitch's premature filing had been the thread that unraveled the whole of it. Not because she had set out to expose a fraud, she had set out to keep her land, but because she had gone when it would have been easier not to, and because the man at the desk had read the law straight and been paying enough attention to see the pattern. "You know what you did," Grant said, not as a compliment but as a statement of fact. "I know," she said. In January of 1891, she told him she was expecting. They were in the kitchen on a winter evening, the fire going, Walter and Clara already asleep, the wind doing its particular winter thing outside. She told him plainly, the way she did everything, and watched his face. Grant Langston, who was thorough and careful and precise in everything he did, looked at his wife across the kitchen table, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It came fully open, the way a window comes open in warm weather, with no reserve and no composure and nothing managed about it. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her hands and held them for a long moment, and she saw the depth of feeling in him that she had always known was there, but that he did not generally allow to surface so completely. "Are you well?" he asked, first thing. Not exclamation, not declaration, just the first real question. "I am very well," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed them to his mouth and held them there, and she felt the warmth of him and the solidity of him, and thought about how far she had traveled from the morning she had saddled Duchess in the dark, and ridden north through a country she did not entirely know, and how it turned out she had been riding toward something after all, even when she was riding as hard as she could just to hold on to what she already had. In September of 1891, she gave birth to a boy. He was large and loud and had Grant's dark hair, and already a look about his eyes that Grant said was entirely Birdie's. They named him Thomas Grant Langston, because there was no way to name him that did not want to carry both the past and the present, and this way it did. Walter, who was 11 by then and had developed the specific gravity of a boy on the edge of young manhood, held his new half-brother with a careful reverence that made Birdie's heart break open cleanly, the good kind of breaking. Clara declared that Thomas was her favorite person who could not yet talk, and immediately began explaining to him the proper taxonomy of grasshoppers, which she had been developing for 2 years. Samuel Crow, who had become a genuine friend over the intervening time, sent a letter of congratulations that was warm and funny, and included a hand-drawn map of the homestead property as it had been officially surveyed, marked up with the landmarks that had grown into family legend: the oak tree at the south edge, the good water, the dairy barn, the house itself. He had labeled the house simply Hawthorne Langston, which Birdie had, without any premeditation, felt exactly right. The years that followed were not easy, because the frontier never was, and Oklahoma Territory was in a constant state of becoming something, which was exciting and difficult in approximately equal measure. The drought of 1893 was hard, and they got through it with the reserves they had built and with the dairy operation, which was less dependent on rainfall than the grain crop. Grant's work took him across a wide stretch of the territory, and the weeks he was away were the weeks that most required her to be the particular person she had always been, capable and stubborn and pointed in a useful direction. But he always came back. That was the fundamental thing. He always came back, and she was always there, and what was between them had been built on the same quality of material she used for everything else, something honest and good and meant to last. Pearl Dubois and her husband remained their closest neighbors and friends, and the Dubois farm and the Hawthorne Langston homestead developed the kind of interdependency that the frontier always created between good neighbors: shared equipment, shared labor at harvest, shared company through the long winters. Pearl's children grew up alongside Walter and Clara and young Thomas with the particular familiarity of children who have spent enough time together that they have stopped being polite. Walter, at 14, began a formal correspondence with the Federal Survey Office in Guthrie about survey methodologies, which Grant had encouraged because it was abundantly clear that this was Walter's direction. At 17, he went to Guthrie for a full year of training and came back a junior surveyor with the precise vocabulary and the careful eyes to match. And when he walked the property's boundaries with his instruments, he did it with the same methodical care that had been in him since he was 9 years old, holding the far end of a rope in the autumn sun. Clara, who turned out to have both her mother's stubbornness and a facility with numbers that surprised everyone except Birdie, was reading law by 16, borrowing Grant's books and annotating them in the margins in a cramped, furious handwriting. She had opinions about the Homestead Act and about the land claim processes, and about the specific injustices that allowed the Fitch pattern to occur in the first place, and she expressed them with a clarity and force that made Grant, who had opinions of his own, feel genuinely persuaded more than once. When Clara was 20, she went to study in the new territorial capital, working in a law office and reading every case she could find that involved land rights and widows' claims, and the structural gaps that the law had left open for people like Fitch to exploit. Birdie read her letters with enormous pride and the specific satisfaction of someone who understood, from personal experience, exactly what her daughter was working toward. Thomas Grant Langston grew into a boy who had his mother's steadiness and his father's careful attention, and a particular laugh that belonged to nobody but himself. A big, uncomplicated laugh that rang out over the homestead in a way that made whatever room he was in feel lighter. He learned surveying from Walter, law from Clara's letters, farming from his mother, and the particular discipline of principled work from his father, and he grew up with all of it braided together into someone who seemed to know quite clearly who he was. In the spring of 1895, Birdie and Grant added another room to the house, proper frame construction now, the sod walls having been replaced by degrees as money allowed, and she planted roses along the front, which were a luxury she had been intending for several years. She had ordered them from a catalog, spending more time on the selection than she had spent on any purely decorative thing in her life. And when they came and she put them in the ground and they began to grow, she felt a satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of grain harvests and dairy yields and legal victories. The satisfaction of something that existed purely to be beautiful, and that she had chosen to make room for. Grant came home on a Wednesday in May, having been in the southern district for 10 days, and he stood in front of the house and looked at the roses starting up the front wall and said nothing for a moment. Then he put his arm around her shoulders and said, "That is the best thing that has happened to the front of this house." "Do not tell the dairy barn," she said. "The dairy barn knows its value," he said. They stood there in the May sunshine, Grant with his arm around her, the roses putting out their first season's growth, Thomas running somewhere behind the house in the loud way he had, and they stood there together, and it was an entirely ordinary moment in their married life, and also a moment of the kind of happiness that feels, when you are in it, like a completed thing. She thought sometimes about the morning she had ridden away from this place in the dark, on a mare named Duchess with a saddlebag of papers and a pistol she had hoped not to use. She thought about the 4 days through the hard country, the storm, Samuel Crow's canvas tent, the limestone overhang where she had camped the first night looking at the stars. She thought about walking into a land office in a town called Redemption and setting her papers on a desk. She thought about how the law was supposed to work, but often did not. About how the people it was designed to protect were so often the people it most thoroughly failed. About how it had taken her riding 4 days alone to get what she was owed, and how that should not have been remarkable, and how Grant had said exactly that from the very beginning. She thought about what it meant to have been seen clearly and chosen, and what that did to a person, the particular kind of anchoring it provided. And she thought about Thomas, her first Thomas, the man who had brought her to this land and worked it with her and loved her well. And she held that love with the quiet permanence it deserved, the way you hold something that has become part of the country of yourself, inseparable from the landscape, present in every season. The 160 acres was all of these things at once. It was Thomas's furrows and her labor and Grant's signature on the protection order, and Walter's survey maps and Clara's annotated law books and young Thomas's laugh bouncing off the walls of the extended house, and the roses going up the front and 1 and 2's descendants in the dairy barn and the cottonwood seeds drifting across the yard in the spring air. It was hers. It was theirs. It was the thing she had ridden 4 days through hard country to keep, and she had kept it, and it had grown into something she could not have imagined standing alone in the dark with a saddled horse and 2 sleeping children, and the determination that had always been the most fundamental thing about her. One evening in late October of 1896, she and Grant sat on the porch as they often did in the good weather, watching the land go to dusk in that particular way Oklahoma land did, the colors extravagant and brief, and then suddenly dark. Thomas was inside at the table with his schoolwork, talking to himself in the low, preoccupied way he had. The creek said its thing. The dairy cows moved in the barn, the stars were coming out in the east. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Grant said, "if you had not ridden to Redemption?" She considered this seriously. "Sometimes," she said, "but it is not a very useful thing to think about because I always would have." "I know," he said, "but I think about it from my side." She looked at him. His face was turned toward the dark horizon, the familiar angles of it lit by the last of the dusk. They had been married 5 years. She knew the terrain of him as well as she knew her own land. "What do you think about it?" she asked. "I think I might have spent a very long time being thorough and correct and useful," he said, "and nothing more than that." He turned to look at her. And then a woman walked into my office with oilskin-wrapped papers and a chin like a surveyor's line, and I thought, I have never seen that before. He paused. I had not. I still have not. I never will again. She held his gaze for a long moment. The night was full and warm, and the stars were doing their excessive, impossible thing overhead. "I have never seen anything like you either," she said, in case that was unclear. "It was not unclear," he said, "but it is good to hear." She took his hand in the autumn dark, the way she had taken it across the kitchen table in that winter long ago when everything had been uncertain and tender and new. His hand was the same, large and warm and still. The creek ran on. The stars burned. The land breathed around them. 160 acres of Oklahoma territory that knew their names and held their history in every turned furrow and built wall and planted row. The living record of everything they had each, separately and together, been willing to ride through hard country to keep. She held his hand and they watched the night come in, and there was nothing left unfinished between them, nothing left unsaid that needed saying, only the good and permanent fact of what they had built together, which was a life, and which was enough, and which would go on being enough through all the seasons still to come.